Ever wondered which 12 films from the 1960s shocked the world like nothing else? These weren't glossy studio pictures, they were raw, rebellious, and impossible to ignore. Critics tried to bury them, but audiences lined up anyway. Some went for wild spectacle, others for unsettling realism, yet all left a mark that still lingers. And here's the twist. The boldest shocks weren't always where you expected. 2,000 Maniacs, 1964. Imagine stumbling into a cheerful southern town where the residents welcome you with smiles, parades, and old-fashioned hospitality. Now, imagine that hospitality turning into a nightmare as the locals reveal they're not ordinary townsfolk at all, but spirits seeking revenge. That was the wild premise of 2,000 Maniacs. Herschel Gordon Lewis's follow-up to his breakthrough hit Blood Feast. On the surface, it looked like a carnival, a reenactment of Southern pride, marching bands, and community events. But soon visitors lured off the highway discovered that every picnic contest and celebration had a sinister twist. The movie reveled in outrageous spectacles staged in broad daylight. For audiences in 1964, used to tidy Hollywood horror, the sheer audacity was startling. This wasn't a creepy shadow in the night. It was horror thrown straight at you under the blazing sun. Censors were not amused. Several states demanded heavy edits or refused to license the film altogether. Yet the controversy acted like free advertising. Drive-ins and grindhouse theaters packed screenings, with viewers daring each other not to look away. Critics called it tasteless, but the crowd reaction told another story. They laughed, gasped, and cringed in equal measure. The legacy of 2,000 Maniacs goes beyond its shocks. It showed that low-budget cinema could mix camp folklore and outrageous imagery to create something unforgettable. Lewis wasn't polishing his work for awards. He was proving that pushing the screen's limits could be profitable. Today it stands as one of the key titles that defined what exploitation could be. Bold, brash, and unforgettable. Color, Me Blood Red, 1965. A painter desperate for attention. A canvas that demands more than just brushstrokes. That was the hook for Color Me Blood Red, the final chapter in Herschel Gordon Lewis's unofficial Blood Trilogy. If Blood Feast gave audiences gore and 2,000 Maniacs, delivered carnival mayhem, this film twisted the world of art into a macabre sideshow. The story followed an artist frustrated by critics who dismissed his work. Then came the eureka moment he discovered that his paintings came alive with a shocking new color. Where did he get it? Let's just say it wasn't from a paint store. Audiences watched as creativity turned into obsession with canvases smeared in a way that left viewers squirming. It was absurd, grotesque, and somehow mesmerizing. Released in 1965, the film wasn't embraced by mainstream critics. They panned it for being crass and sensational, but for grindhouse fans, that was exactly the appeal. In theaters that thrived on shock, Color Me Blood Red fit perfectly alongside monster flicks and biker dramas. Its mix of camp humor, wild imagery, and deliberate provocation kept crowds entertained, even as some stormed out in protest. What makes the film endure is how it captures the strange marriage of art and exploitation. It satirized the art world while gleefully indulging in spectacle. The director leaned into every over-the-top review, knowing bad press sold more tickets than glowing praise. Decades later, the movie is still remembered, not for finesse, but for nerve. It dared to make a mockery of high culture, while proving that low-budget cinema could spark conversation just by crossing lines. In the canon of outrageous 60s exploitation, Color Me Blood Red remains a bold brushstroke that audiences never forgot. Scum of the Earth, 1963. If Blood Feast put gore on the map, Scum of the Earth dragged audiences into a dirtier corner. Herschel Gordon Lewis once again proved he wasn't afraid of backlash this time, ditching bright colors for grimy black and white. Marketed as the first roughie, it stripped away the playful charm of earlier pin-up films and exposed a darker world. The setup was simple, but nasty. A naive college girl lured into modeling, only to find herself trapped in a web of coercion. The so-called photographers behind the camera weren't interested in fashion. They were predators exploiting every ounce of her desperation. The atmosphere reeked of cheap motels, dirty back rooms, and manipulation. For viewers in 1963, this wasn't fun fantasy, it was uncomfortably close to real-life sleaze. Censors pounced instantly. Cities like Boston and Memphis refused licenses. In Los Angeles, screenings sparked outrage from community groups. Critics declared it the end of cinema as they knew it. But in grindhouse districts like New York's 42nd Street scum of the earth, found its audience. People weren't showing up for glossy escapism, they wanted to peek into the forbidden, to watch something raw and shocking. What made it legendary wasn't craft, but nerve. It was unapologetically bleak, and Lewis even admitted later they made it simply because filth paid the rent. That honesty turned it into a cult classic. Audiences walked out feeling grimy, but they remembered it. And that's the secret weapon of exploitation. It sticks to you long after the credits roll. Bad Girls. Go to Hell. 1965. Doris Wishman didn't follow the rules. She didn't have Hollywood budgets, big stars, or fancy sets. What she had was determination and a taste for stories that mainstream studios wouldn't touch. Bad Girls. Go to Hell is perhaps her most infamous work, a low-budget thriller that shook mid-60s audiences with its mix of raw storytelling and taboo themes. The movie followed a young housewife whose ordinary life spirals out of control after one bad encounter sets her on the run. From that moment, everything snowballs. Shady strangers, shifting identities, and a constant sense of paranoia. Wishman shot it with handheld grit, favoring close-ups and stark locations over polish. The effect was a story that felt less like fiction and more like a fever dream captured on cheap film stock. For audiences in 1965, this wasn't glossy drama, it was a plunge into chaos. Community boards tried to shut it down, accusing it of being indecent. Critics panned its rough style, but underground theaters couldn't get enough. Word spread quickly. This wasn't another safe B-movie. It was something stranger, raw, and far more daring. Wishman's film still divides opinions. Some dismiss it as sloppy, others hail it as a feminist statement wrapped in grindhouse grit. Either way, it cemented her reputation as one of the rare female directors in exploitation, pushing boundaries when few women were allowed behind the camera. Bad Girls. Go to Hell wasn't just shocking. It was proof that exploitation cinema could also carry a bold voice from outside the boys' club. Faster, Pussycat, Kill, Kill, 1965. If one movie screams 60s exploitation at full volume, it's Russ Meyer's Faster, Pussycat, Kill, Kill. Released in 1965, it turned a trio of go-go dancers into the most feared gang on the desert highway. Unlike Meyer's earlier nudie cuties, this film stripped away comedy and leaned into menace, giving audiences something they hadn't seen before: tough, dangerous women who seize control of every frame. The story followed Varla Rosie and Billy, three thrill seekers who leave a trail of chaos as they drag race brawl and scheme their way into trouble. When they cross paths with a reclusive old man guarding hidden money, things spiral into a showdown of greed and violence. Meyer shot it fast and cheap in the Mojave Desert, but the barren landscapes and bold close-ups made it feel larger than life. At the time, critics dismissed it as trash. Mainstream audiences didn't know what to make of women who weren't victims or background characters, but unapologetic forces of destruction. Yet in grindhouse theaters, it was electric. Drive-in crowds cheered the wild fight's sharp dialogue and relentless energy. Decades later, the film's reputation exploded. Roger Ebert called it, beyond doubt, the best movie ever made about women in tight clothes beating up men. Directors like Quentin Tarantino and John Waters declared it a masterpiece of camp and power. What makes Faster, Pussycat, Kill, Kill, unforgettable is its sheer audacity. It flipped gender roles, reveled in its own outrageousness, and proved exploitation didn't have to play by anyone's rules. Once dismissed as disposable, it's now hailed as one of the great cult classics of all time, Olga's House of Shame, 1964. If exploitation cinema had a queen of cruelty, her name was Olga. Played by Audrey Campbell, she ruled the infamous Olga trilogy, and by the time Olga's House of Shame hit theaters in 1964, the formula had reached its rawest form. This wasn't glossy crime drama. It was a dive into the underground world of vice, intimidation, and power. The setup followed Olga as a cold and ruthless queenpin running an empire of vice. Her tools weren't guns or big budgets, they were fear, domination, and authority. Campbell played the role without a hint of camp. She was icy commanding and believable, which only made the atmosphere feel more unsettling. Shot guerrilla style around New York, often with real burlesque dancers and makeshift sets, the film had a gritty handmade feel that actually worked in its favor. Critics hated it. Cities like Boston, Chicago, and Los Angeles banned it outright. In the United Kingdom, it wasn't even classified. Church groups and watchdog organizations campaigned to have screenings shut down. But the protests backfired. On New York's 42nd Street, the film ran for nearly a year, pulling in profits far beyond its tiny budget. For audiences, the shock wasn't gore or spectacle, it was the psychological chill. Olga wasn't a monster lurking in the dark. She was a woman in plain sight, using fear and control as her weapons. That realism struck a nerve. Olga's House of Shame became legendary, not for polish, but for audacity. It proved exploitation didn't need elaborate effects. To shock, it only needed a figure like Olga, cold and commanding, holding the audience in her grip. In the 60s, that was enough to rattle anyone brave enough to buy a ticket. The Touch of Her Flesh, 1967. By the late 60s, Michael and Roberta Findlay were carving out their own corner of grindhouse infamy, and The Touch of Her Flesh stands as their most notorious work. Released in 1967 under the pseudonym Julian Marsh, this low-budget thriller leaned into pure grit, delivering a story that felt both shocking and relentless. The premise followed Richard Jennings, a man left blinded and broken after a terrible accident. Instead of finding redemption, he spirals into bitterness and rage. What unfolded was a grim tale of obsession and vengeance staged in dingy apartments and cheap New York streets. The Findlays shot fast and dirty, turning their lack of resources into atmosphere. The film looked raw because it was raw. Critics despised it. Mainstream reviewers branded it ugly and tasteless, and censorship boards in Boston, Detroit, and even parts of Canada banned screenings altogether. In New Jersey, one theater owner was actually arrested for showing it, only to reopen with bigger crowds the next night. As always, an exploitation outrage was the best advertisement. Audiences at grindhouses didn't expect polish, they expected nerve. And The Touch of Her Flesh had plenty of it. The Findlays doubled down on every review that called their work filth, even turning that reputation into a marketing tool. The film became so profitable, it spawned 2 sequels, The Curse of Her Flesh and The Kiss of Her Flesh, forming what fans now call the Flesh Trilogy. What makes it unforgettable isn't artistry, but audacity. The Findlays embraced controversy knowing it sold tickets. Their films weren't designed to win awards. They were designed to make jaws drop and wallets open. The Touch of Her Flesh proved once again that in 60s exploitation shock value was the currency and the Findlays were masters of the trade. The Sadist, 1963. Before slasher films ever became a trend, The Sadist offered a chilling preview. Directed by James Landis, this low-budget thriller was inspired loosely by the real-life case of spree killers, Charles Starkweather and Carol Fugate. But instead of telling that story directly, it created its own grim, claustrophobic nightmare. The film followed 3 teachers whose car breaks down in the desert. What should have been a simple inconvenience turns into terror when they stumble upon a junkyard ruled by a deranged young man and his girlfriend. Played with unnerving intensity by Arch Hall Jr., the sadistic drifter toys with them, dragging out their fear as if the violence itself were entertainment. For audiences in 1963, this was no ordinary thriller. Hollywood crime films tended to glamorize villains or make them charming rogues. Here there was no charm, just raw menace. Hall's performance shocked viewers with its unpredictability. He laughed, he shouted, and he turned the desert into a trap that felt inescapable. Critics were rattled, many calling the film too harsh, too cruel, and too real. Censorship boards hesitated, but independent theaters embraced it. On the grindhouse circuit, The Sadist earned a reputation as one of the most disturbing pictures of its time. Its legacy lies in its influence, long before slasher villains like Michael Myers or Freddy Krueger. The Sadist showed audiences a killer who wasn't glamorous, just terrifying. In doing so, it helped set the stage for decades of horror to come. She-Devils on Wheels, 1968. By the late 60s, biker films were tearing up drive-ins across America. But Herschel Gordon Lewis wasn't about to make just another tale of leather jackets and roaring engines. With She-Devils on Wheels released in 1968, he gave audiences something they'd never seen before, an all-female motorcycle gang ruling the road with no apologies. The gang known as the Man-Eaters lived by their own wild code. They raced, they fought, and they made the rules. For drive-in audiences used to tough biker guys, this role reversal was a shock. Lewis leaned into the chaos filling the screen, with desert chases, backroad brawls, and a gang of women who refused to play by anyone else's standards. Critics, unsurprisingly, were horrified. They called it tasteless, ridiculous, and beyond the pale. But the very things critics hated were the things that made it a cult hit. Grindhouse fans couldn't get enough of the wild energy, the colorful gang dynamics, and the sheer audacity of flipping a macho genre on its head. Financially, it was a win. Shot cheaply in Florida with local bikers and non-professional actors, it quickly made back its budget and then some. Posters shouted about the most daring biker film ever, and audiences lined up to see if it lived up to the hype. It did. Today, She-Devils on Wheels stands as a landmark of 60s exploitation. It wasn't slick or polished, but it was fearless. By putting women front and center in a genre dominated by men, it shocked viewers in a way that still feels bold decades later. For Herschel Gordon Lewis, it was proof that when it came to shock cinema, even the open road was fair game. Venus in Furs, 1967. By the late 60s, European filmmakers were catching on to what American grindhouses had been doing all along, pushing boundaries and blurring art with exploitation. Venus in Furs, directed by Massimo Dallamano, took inspiration from the famous novel by Leopold von Sacher-Masoch, but twisted it into a surreal, dreamlike drama that shocked audiences in 1967. The film told the story of a young man drawn into the orbit of a mysterious woman whose allure seemed both irresistible and dangerous. What unfolded was less a traditional narrative and more a hypnotic journey through obsession power and submission. Lush cinematography, haunting music, and strange imagery made it feel closer to a fever dream than a straight drama. Critics in Europe were divided. Some praised its artistry, while others condemned it as exploitative. When it crossed over to the United States, it was marketed less as art and more as a forbidden spectacle. Posters promised shocking revelations, and grindhouse audiences showed up eager to see what the fuss was about. What set Venus in Furs apart was its ability to balance style with shock. Unlike some 60s exploitation, which thrived purely on grime, this one dared to look elegant while still breaking taboos. That uneasy mix made it memorable and controversial. Today it stands as a reminder that exploitation wasn't always cheap thrills. Sometimes it borrowed the tools of art cinema to create something haunting, strange, and impossible to forget. Venus in Furs proved that shock value and style could go hand in hand. Blast of Silence, 1961. Not every shocking 60s film relied on gore titillation or outrageous spectacle. Some shocked by being too real, too bleak, too honest. Blast of Silence, directed by Alan Barron in 1961, looked on the surface like a gritty noir, but it played like an exploitation film in disguise. Why? Because it refused to dress crime up as glamorous. Instead, it stripped it bare, leaving audiences disturbed by just how ordinary violence and loneliness could look. The story followed Frankie Bono, a contract killer returning to New York City during Christmas to carry out a job. But instead of a slick gangster tale, viewers got something far different. Frankie was no charismatic anti-hero. He was broken bitter and suffocating in his own isolation. The narration delivered in a gravelly second-person voice put the audience right in his shoes. You're alone, you'll always be alone. That relentless voice turned the movie into a psychological assault. Barron shot the film guerrilla style on the streets of New York, often without permits. Real pedestrians wandered into shots unaware they were being filmed. The result was a city that felt alive, dirty, and dangerous. Snow fell on gritty sidewalks, exhaust choked the air, and the loneliness of the holidays dripped off every frame. Viewers weren't watching Hollywood's idea of crime. They were watching something that looked uncomfortably real. When it premiered, mainstream critics didn't know what to make of it. Some dismissed it as too harsh, too grim, and too amateur. But in grindhouse circuits, it found new life. Audiences who came expecting a simple hitman story left shaken by its bleak honesty. Over time, Blast of Silence was rediscovered and restored by archivists now hailed as a lost classic. But in its own time, it was an outsider, a misfit. And that's exactly what made it an exploitation milestone. Unlike the over-the-top gore films of the decade, Blast of Silence shocked by holding up a mirror, it dared to say, crime isn't cool, it's cold. And in a decade filled with spectacle, that kind of raw truth might have been the most shocking thing of all. And that's the list: 12 60s exploitation films that tore through the rules and left audiences reeling. From wild carnival revenge tales to bleak city crime stories, these films proved shock could take many forms. Which one still hits hardest for you? Let me know in the comments, share this with a fellow film buff, and subscribe for more dives into cinema's wild side. Because the movies the world tried to hide are often the ones we never forget.